Hello Americans channel. This video is made by free videos from Storyblocks, and these images and video we use just for explanation, and it's free use also.
Quarry reopens after 25 years. Then crew members find this. When the machines roared back to life at the long-abandoned quarry, no one expected anything unusual. The place had been neglected and ignored for 2 decades. Just dust, rock, and a job that needed doing. But when one of the excavation machines hit some piece of metal, the crew discovered something that no one was supposed to find. The crew arrived on Monday morning. It was still dark outside, and with the quarry's location far from town, it was nice and quiet, but that was about to change. Carl and his team were to clean up 25 years of overgrowth and debris from this forgotten quarry. The task seemed simple, or so they thought. The goal set for Carl and his team was to completely strip the quarry to its bare, rocky walls, and even expand it by well over 100 feet for more stone delving possibilities. With a massively growing house market, the need for stone increased tremendously over the years. But there was one big problem, and that problem arose quickly after they started delving. It took the team 2 days to clear all the loose debris from the quarry. They had heavy machinery and plenty of modern tools, making the task easy. Spirits were high since the expansion of the quarry was a big job, which provided financial security. But then, on the 3rd day, the team hit a major roadblock. The digging crane was down in the quarry, and with it, the team had already started deepening and expanding the quarry walls. Suddenly, an ear-deafening sound was heard at the front of the crane. The entire team was shaken up by it. What the hell was that? Hop was looking over it, but could find no loss. It seemed to flow. It sounded like a loud clang, the kind you get when metal hits metal. Carl and his team knew that one of the metal components must have been the digging part of their crane, but what it slammed against was a mystery. The workers all stopped and started running over to the hole created by the crane. When the team looked into the hole created by the crane, they saw a metallic shimmer surface facing them. It was yellowish in color, but other than that, it was hard to make out what it was. Carl ordered his crew to pick up shovels to excavate the object from the ground. His team started digging right away. The team started digging around the object. Rocks were shattered and sand fell from its side. At first, the team only saw a speckle of yellow metal, but they quickly noticed that the object was far larger than they had imagined. It was at least 5 feet in diameter. "What can it be?" crew members whispered. After a little bit more digging around the object, the team used their high-powered crane to do the rest of the lifting. Cables were attached to suitable areas, and with some wiggling of the vehicle, they managed to slowly move the object upward. The object was also at least 6 feet deep, and the team looked on in awe. "Maybe there's gold inside," one of Carl's workers said enthusiastically. But it became obvious pretty fast that this wasn't a safe at all. What it was hard to make out, since it was still partially stuck in the ground. After excavating it for the most part, crew members started to become even more nervous and excited. With the object removed from the ground, Carl and his team circled it as it stood between them. The metal was very corroded from being in the ground for so long. There were doors on both sides. Carl didn't hesitate and started pulling on the handle of the first one. To his surprise, it opened up. The crew leader stood inside the strange object. It was about 3 feet deep, with an entrance and exit door. The others looked puzzled, but Carl, a bit older, recognized it. He'd seen construction like this before. It was a tunnel door, built to support heavy earth while workers passed safely through newly dug or unstable underground spaces. Carl stepped through the other side of the object and saw his crew still staring at it, mystified. But he ignored the object and walked straight to the hole they'd dug. He looked down into the pit the crane had opened and noticed something that confirmed his growing suspicion. Something unusual carved into the wall of the deep, dark excavation site. If there was a tunnel door, Carl figured there had to be a tunnel. He pointed and the others followed his gaze. A round opening became visible inside the hole. "It's a tunnel!" "But where does it go?" someone asked. Nervous excitement buzzed through the group. The opening was real, but none of them were ready for what lay ahead. Carl took a deep breath and stared into the tunnel's dark mouth. "All right, we're going in," he said, trying to steady his nerves. He told the crew to grab flashlights. Though hesitant, one by one, they obeyed and joined him. The sense of danger was real, but so was curiosity. Together, they stepped into the eerie, unknown passage. They were even more corroded than the doorway, indicating that this place had been untouched for decades. Dust and cobwebs filled the air as they proceeded. The tunnel walls, however, were unnaturally clean-cut, suggesting that this tunnel was either made by a tunneling master years ago or maintained throughout its years of existence. The deeper they went, the more questions arose. Who had dug this tunnel, and why? Their flashlights lit rusted beams, clear signs of long-term structural planning. The tunnel twisted unpredictably, its walls stable but mysterious. The air grew colder with every step. Their boots crunched softly on the dirt, the only sound in a space otherwise buried in silence. Carl led with steady resolve, his experience keeping the team moving. Behind him, anxious whispers filled the tunnel, growing louder with each step. Suddenly, a chilling cry echoed down the passage. Everyone froze. Their flashlight shook in unison. The sound didn't belong there. All eyes turned to Carl, seeking guidance, but even he looked uncertain for a second. The cry rattled them. Fear surged. Fear of the unknown, fear of collapse, fear of never leaving the tunnel. Carl turned and saw his crew's panicked faces. "It's okay, we're together," he said, though a tremor escaped his voice. The tunnel felt tighter now, like it was closing in. The air hung heavy, pressing on everyone's shoulders without mercy. Some had reached their limit. Mark, one of the youngest, muttered, "I'm not staying down here another second," and turned around. A few followed, panic in their eyes. Their retreat echoed loudly as they scrambled back. Carl didn't stop them. He understood. Bravery couldn't be forced, and fear down here was more dangerous than any physical threat. The tunnel was too narrow for the entire team anyway, and he didn't want anyone down here with him who didn't want to be there. "Fear is a liability down here," he said to the remaining cast. After the dust settled, Carl and only 5 other crew members remained inside the tunnel. They were alone in the dark, but determined to press on. Carl urged the remaining crew to stay close and stay strong. They were already this deep, and turning back meant giving up. "We're finding out what's in here," he said, scanning ahead with his beam. The others nodded reluctantly. Their flashlights flickered in the dust-filled air, and every step forward was driven by purpose and growing curiosity. The tunnel changed subtly. Its width shrank, beams drew closer together, and strange colored markings appeared on each support, different hues but all the same shape. Carl narrowed his eyes. It didn't feel random. Something or someone had made this to guide them. "We're supposed to follow this," he muttered, and deep down he knew he was right. That strange sound returned, faint, melodic, and eerie. It drifted down the tunnel almost like it was calling them. Carl hesitated for the first time. "Are we doing this?" he asked. The crew exchanged glances, then nodded. They were many, and the sound was only one. Steeling themselves, they stepped forward toward the lure of the unknown. "Let's move quietly," Carl whispered. The tunnel bent sharply, and as they rounded the corner, a massive underground chamber came into view. The space was larger than Carl's entire house. The crew crawled through a tight entrance and stood in awe. Tools, walls with carvings, and an entire subterranean structure lay before them. Hidden, ancient, and astonishing. Scribbly drawings were etched into the rocky walls all around them, and recognizable tools were leaning against the side of the cave-like room. They were old but looked well-maintained. "What is this place? And why is all of this down here? One crew member asked Carl, hoping that he would know, but Carl simply shrugged his shoulders. Carl stared at the symbol on the dusty tool. He recognized it, but couldn't quite place where from. Before he could say anything, that familiar sound echoed again, followed by something new. Footsteps. The crew stiffened. It wasn't just a sound anymore. Something or someone was coming. Carl spun around, signaling to his team. There was no time to think. It was clear that whatever caused these sounds was getting closer because the footsteps that were first heard in the far distance quickly grew louder and louder. Carl's crew exchanged nervous glances, not wanting to get caught somewhere they did not belong. "We have to hide," Carl whispered to his time while pointing back to the tunnel from which they came. Hidden behind boulders, Carl and the crew held their breath. A group of elderly men shuffled into the chamber. They wore worn-out work clothes, their silver hair glinting in the lamplight. None looked under 60. One man carried an old oil lantern. Carl's crew exchanged bewildered glances. Who were these people? And why were they down here? One of the older men carried an oil lantern, its soft yellow glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. As he swung the lantern back and forth, the metal hinge made the familiar whining sound Carl and his team had heard before in the tunnel. Now Carl and his team knew its source. The echoes amplified the noise, making it much scarier than it truly was. A group of elderly men seemed oblivious to the hidden crew watching them. They went about their routine, lighting more lanterns placed around the room. As the chamber grew brighter, Carl and his team saw makeshift beds, worn but functional, made from old metal carts and other mining equipment. One of Carl's crew members, unable to contain his shock, let out a small gasp. Unfortunately, the gasp was loud enough to catch the attention of the elderly men. As a response, one of the men snapped his head toward the dark corner where Carl's team was hiding. "Who's there?" the man called out sternly. Carl signaled his team to stay still, but it was too late. They were heard, and slowly he began walking toward the spot where Carl and his team were crouched. Carl quietly turned and, together with his team, ran back into the tunnel from which they had entered. It was a long route back to the surface, but they had to try and escape. Their footsteps were swift, and without being caught, they reached the first bend in the tunnel. A checkpoint, it felt like. But before they could maneuver past it, they were halted by the old man's voice. "Stop! We mean you no harm," one of the men called out. Carl halted, finding the tone of this man's voice far removed from a threat. He turned his face and saw that the man with the lantern remained standing at the end of the tunnel opening. He had no intention of following Carl and his crew, and suddenly seemed harmless. Carl addressed his teammates, saying he felt that they should go back to the man. "We came here to discover what was down here, so let's find out together." His team carefully agreed, and together they walked back to the open space. Once there, the elderly man raised his lantern higher, illuminating Carl and his crew as they stood frozen, unsure what to do. "We just want to talk," the old man said. There was no malice in his voice, just a gentle invitation. Carl looked at his team, and together they cautiously stepped into the light. The rest of the elderly men had retreated to their makeshift beds, resuming their quiet routine. The man with the lantern approached Carl, extending his hand in greeting. "My name is John," he said, the man's eyes twinkling with curiosity. "How did you find this place?" Carl explained how they had been working at the quarry above, clearing rubble and debris when they hit an old tunnel door. John's eyes widened instantly after Carl told him this, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. His fellow cavemen looked alarmed too by this revelation. John's companion was quite up to this point, but after Carl explained, they all became very animated and sprang up from their metal beds. Excited glances were passed on amongst one another. "After all these years," John murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. John started to cry, which surprised Carl and his crew. But the old man had a good reason for this. John saw Carl's and his crew's confused faces and promised to explain the situation, and the story that he revealed then was the craziest thing Carl had ever heard. John and the other men down here were part of a mining crew that had worked in this very place decades ago. This used to be an active mine, and a large one at that. We were digging deep when an earthquake hit. It shifted the ground and collapsed almost all the tunnels. He paused, the memory clearly painful. Most of the workers made it out, but we got trapped down here. Carl and his team listened in stunned silence as John continued his heart-wrenching story. The old man scraped his throat and started speaking again. At first, we did our best digging ourselves out from within, but we quickly discovered that it was impossible with our equipment down here. Then we waited, hoping someone would come for us, but no one did. We guessed that the collapse was too severe and that after not being able to reach this deep down, we were presumed dead. Over time, we realized that no rescue was coming. We were stuck, and this became our home. The other men nodded sadly, the weight of their decades-long isolation heavy on their faces. We've been stuck down here for well over 30 years, all forgotten about, but still very much alive. A tear rolled down the poor man's cheek. It was a heartbreaking story. John explained that they had survived all these years on stored provisions. There were enough canned goods down here to feed an entire mining operation for years, he said. But with only 8 of us, the food supply could last us a lifetime. We rationed and ate rice and beans every day. We would not starve, but loneliness was our biggest enemy. John's voice was steady, but the hardships they must have endured were clear. Carl shook his head. That was over 30 years ago, he said softly. And all this time you've been down here? John nodded. Yes, and we had no way of getting out. The tunnels were sealed off and we couldn't dig our way out without risking a collapse. The room fell silent as Carl processed what John had just told him. The miners had spent 3 decades trapped underground, forgotten by the world above, but now there was hope, because this story was about to get a continuation after being halted for decades. We can help you, Carl said with enthusiasm in his voice. To the door we found, Carl said. It's open now. There's a way up to the surface again. John's eyes widened again, and his fellow miners looked at each other in shock. Are you serious? John asked, his voice trembling with emotion. Carl nodded. Yes, we can get you out of here. For a moment, no one spoke. Then John let out a deep sigh as if the weight of all those years had finally lifted. With Carl's help, the miners were slowly led back through the tunnels to the surface. After so many years underground, the daylight was blinding, and the men blinked in amazement as they stepped into the open air for the first time in decades. The world they had known was gone, replaced by a new reality they could barely comprehend. But they were grateful to be part of it again. With the help of Carl's crew, the 8 elderly miners were brought to the hospital. They stayed there for over 2 weeks for observation. After that, they were free men once more. Some miners still had family alive, and those reunions were emotional and heartwarming. Even Carl, who never cried, wiped away a tear when he witnessed their embrace. We were just there to reinstate a quarry, and now we saved 8 lives. This is crazy. You can't make this stuff up, he said. News of the discovery spread quickly. And soon Carl and his crew were hailed as heroes. They made national news and were often asked to tell their story. But they didn't mind. The fact remained that these old miners were safe again and families were happy. The mine was closed for good now, preventing further collapse. And a few months later, the quarry was successfully reinstated.